Well, good morning to everybody, and special welcome to Senator Nick McKim today, who's going to give us a presentation about his perspectives on communications in Australia at the moment. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today and across Australia, and also emerging leaders, past, present and future. So let's hand over to Senator Nick McKim.
Well, thanks, Teresa, and hello, everyone. Thanks for allowing me the opportunity to speak today. I'm coming to you from Muwinina land on Lutruwita, Tasmania, and I acknowledge that this land was never ceded. Well, 2020 has been such a disruptive year to almost every single facet of society, and over the last 12 months, much of our lives have moved from IRL in real life to moving online, and particularly this year, that existing trend has been kicked into overdrive. There have been some positives to this. We've all had to innovate to work remotely. We've many of us cut our travel time and realised we don't have to be in our offices all the time. But there have been some really huge gulfs revealed, particularly when it comes to the digital divide. And to be without a reliable high-speed internet connection in 2020 is to be excluded in a way that many people have not experienced for a very long time. And for those of us who are online with good, reliable, fast internet, there are some really serious threats to our privacy and to our digital rights. One thing that we've been keeping a close eye on is the Intergovernmental Agreement on Identity Matching Services that COAG signed in 2017. This is a system that will provide real-time access to passport, visa and driver's licence images and other associated data for a wide range of reasons. And as a result of this agreement, for example, in my home state of Tasmania, the Tasmanian government has uploaded people's driver's licence, in fact, everyone's driver's licence photos. 410,000 Tasmanians have had their driver's licence photos uploaded to the quite Orwellian-sounding National Driver Licence Facial Recognition Solution. And it does beg the question, a solution to what exactly? The state governments of Victoria and South Australia have done the same. And the Queensland government has said it will be uploading its driver's licence images and data this year. The ACT government is the only state or territory government to date to say that it won't be providing its licence photos and associated data until relevant enabling legislation is passed. And as we sit here today, there is no relevant legislation that regulates the use of that data that has passed through the Commonwealth Parliament. So by around this time next year, there'll be nearly 18 million people living in Australia who will have their images and data stored in the Commonwealth Government's facial recognition system, a system, as I said, that as yet has no enabling legislation in place. So we've had the very conservative Parliamentary Joint Standing Committee on Intelligence and Security rejecting the proposed enabling legislation. That's the first time it's rejected legislation since the Howard government, and has recommended that it be redrafted, taking into account privacy, transparency and providing robust safeguards, and that the redrafted legislation be referred back to the Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security for an inquiry. Former Prime Minister Turnbull conceded that private companies could be given access to the information kept in this database. Now, he and others in this government have argued that the system will not be used for mass surveillance, but even if the current government does not, and I would argue it has a strong propensity towards surveillance, but even if it doesn't, there'll be nothing stopping future governments from doing so now that the genie's been let out of the bottle. One of the concerns raised with and recognised by the Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security was in regards for the legislation to provide for mass or blanket surveillance. The committee said it accepted that mass surveillance was not the intended purpose of the legislation, but if that's the case, the government should amend the legislation to explicitly exclude such activities. And that's what the Greens will be looking for in the next draft of the bill and what we'll be pushing for in the Senate. Now, Australia's not the only country, obviously, to use facial recognition technologies, far from it. But if enabling legislation for the National Driver Licence facial recognition solution is passed, we will become the first Western democracy to provide such a system for whole of government purposes. Many people would be aware of China's social credit system, which interacts with hundreds of millions of CCTV cameras around that country, mandatory face scanning of people registering for example, mobile phone services. And that is networked with systems that are used for behavioural engineering, by monitoring, ranking, rewarding and punishing people, but also for identifying and tracking and detaining minority groups, including Uyghurs. It's a dangerous and dystopian future, and unfortunately in Australia, we are currently taking roads down that dangerous path to a surveillance state and ultimately a police state. The Australian government's expansion of its digital identity system, including MyGov ID, is also part of this move. Now, the government could have built MyGov ID using self-sovereign identity, which would have let users create, manage and use multiple discrete digital identities and given users control over disclosures of personal information, which is the approach that countries like Canada and Switzerland have taken. But instead, the Australian government's opted to use a trusted digital information framework, which allows the government to control, store and manage all user data, which creates a honeypot for hackers and denies users any control over what data is disclosed to what organisations. And fair to say, the government's track record on data security in recent years has been anything but laudable. There are currently over 1.6 million Australians using facial recognition to access around 70 different government services, and with millions of people currently having their lives disrupted, many of them being forced onto welfare for the first time because of a global pandemic, and with bleak economic and employment projections over the next couple of years, I'm sure that number will continue to rise rapidly. People are very vulnerable now, and governments are unfortunately taking this opportunity to normalise the collection of biometrics in Australia. The private sector, such as smartphone developers, are also helping to normalise this as they increasingly use biometrics to, whether that be fingerprint or facial recognition, to unlock handsets and access third-party apps. But users of MyGov ID could soon find themselves unable to access social services in the future unless they provide facial biometrics. So privacy and security aside, this also raises concerns around barriers to entry, discrimination and consent. And arguably, millions of Australians will not be able to avoid this facial recognition technology in the future because they are being driven to it by government. And one of the things that we're really concerned about here is false matching or false positives, particularly for non-white people. Those concerns and the potential consequences will increase as MyGov ID is not only rolled out to other levels of government, but also to the private sector. Now, this rollout comes at a time when companies like Amazon and Microsoft have actually stopped selling facial recognition to law enforcement agencies over concerns around racial bias and potential for misuse. Google, Alphabet have called for a temporary ban on facial recognition technology, and IBM has said it will pull out of the facial recognition business. A year after the law was enacted in California, prohibiting the installation, activation or use of any biometric surveillance system with police body cams. And many backers of that law felt compelled to support it after a test of facial recognition software identified 26 California lawmakers as criminals. So there are real problems with that technology and the way that it's being rolled out in Australia. We are very concerned, as I know many people who operate in the digital and consumer spaces are, about the lack of transparency and accountability around biometrics, particularly biometrics collected from employees by employers. Now, Australia has a Privacy Act, but in the digital context, it is not fit for purpose. The Biometrics Institute has produced a biometrics privacy code for industry self-regulation, which has been published and accepted by the Privacy Commissioner. However, the code, which has been adopted by very, very few of the Institute's members, is widely considered a failure, with the Australian Privacy Foundation arguing that, I quote, almost all proposals to apply biometrics in employment have been in breach of even that weak code's provisions. But what I want to focus on here is what government protections we have and what government protections we could have. There's no greater contrast between our Privacy Act 1998 and the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation. Now, coming into force in 2018, the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation is considered gold standard for the protection of consumer information, whereas unfortunately our Privacy Act provides protection over personal information, or to paraphrase former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, what's written in the envelope as opposed to what's written on the envelope. The General Data Protection Regulation provides protection over any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person who can be identified directly or indirectly by personal data. The differences between these legislations are born of philosophical differences between neoliberalism here in Australia and civil libertarianism, which exists in a much stronger form in many other liberal democracies around the world. Unlike Australia's market-based approach to data, the General Data Protection Regulation takes a human rights approach that's focused on people. Unlike Australia's Privacy Act, that regulation applies to all organisations who process or control personal data of EU residents. It requires consent to be given for an organisation to process or control a resident's data, provides individual rights such as the right to data portability, the right to object to the processing of personal data at any time, and the right to erasure, which is really important, the right to be forgotten, the right to erase any personal data held by an organisation, as I said, known as the right to be forgotten. But unlike the EU or every other liberal Western democracy in the world, Australia does not have a charter or Bill of Rights, either constitutionally enshrined or legislatively enshrined. And over the last 20 years, we've had over 200 pieces of legislation passed through state, territory and Commonwealth parliaments, which erode fundamental rights, freedoms and liberties in this country. We've seen those include things like the metadata retention legislation, which was sold to Australians as being all about counter-terrorism and protecting us from the threat from terrorists. And since it's been put in place, we've discovered that it's been used by the broadest range of government agencies, including local governments who use it to harvest data on people in order to support prosecutions for having unregistered pets. And I've heard of scope creep or bracket creep in many different contexts in the past, but that is truly a significant creep of scope in terms of what that legislation is used for. And as we've consistently seen, once your privacy is eroded, it's very, very difficult to get it back. We are moving in this country down the road to a police state and a surveillance state, and the Greens will stand up strongly to protect people's personal liberties, to protect people's privacies, and ultimately to hold the government to account for the decisions that it is making. So alongside many people in the digital rights sector, in the human rights sector, and supported by the Australian Human Rights Commissioner. We in the Greens call on the government for a moratorium on facial recognition technology until that technology has been properly assessed, so we can build in the safeguards that we need, so we can make sure that it's not going to lead to racial profiling or mistakes made in their technology based on people's ethnicity or culture. And really importantly, we'll continue to fight for a Charter of Rights, which certainly needs to include digital rights, because as we remain the only liberal democracy in the world without such a charter or Bill of Rights, unfortunately, we will continue to see our rights and freedoms eroded.
Thank you very much for that, Senator. It's very good to hear what the Greens' positions are in relation to these issues. Just have a couple of questions for you now. I wanted to ask you about the Privacy Act that we've currently got that's being reviewed, the Privacy Act 1988, as part of the ACCC's digital platforms inquiry and the response from the government. The Act aims to ensure that privacy settings empower consumers to protect their data. What's the main change you'd like to see to the Privacy Act as a result of the review?
Well, we'd certainly like to see a more comprehensive response to people's privacy concerns, as I mentioned in my speech, and obviously the European Union standard is one that we should aspire to. But the review will also, amongst many other things, consider whether a statutory tort for serious invasions of privacy should be introduced into Australian law. And our view is that a tort would help protect people from abuses of and invasions of their privacy and provide them with an opportunity to obtain legal remedies. And from our point of view, that would be welcome, as along with greater personal controls and permissions over private data, including metadata, and a right to be forgotten. But ultimately, until we've got a Charter of Rights in place in this country, we will lack a comprehensive framework that protects people's privacy in Australia.
We've recently seen governments around the world, including Australia, start to raise concerns about the issue of consumers' data privacy when it comes to social media platforms. Do you believe stronger regulation is needed to keep consumers safe, or is it up to individuals to know how much of their personal data they're actually giving away on these sites?
Well, I think it's important that people do understand that at a personal level, and I encourage people to have a look at what, to the greatest degree they can, what happens to their data through social media platforms. But it's not just about people taking responsibility themselves. There are many people who can't do that for various reasons. So we need to make sure that there is actually proper regulation in place. And if corporations, as they've consistently shown, are not prepared to protect the interests of private people by adequately managing their data, providing transparency around their data, then governments absolutely need to step in and regulate. And I just remind people, to quote Tristan Harris in The Social Dilemma, if you don't pay for the product, you are the product. And social media companies are actually data harvesting companies, and that's the basis of their business model. And we need to do far, far more to make sure that they respect people's privacy, respect people's data. And again, they've consistently shown they're not prepared to do that. So from the Greens' point of view, it is important that the government regulate in that space.
Thanks a lot for your time today, Senator. That's excellent.
Thanks, Teresa. Much appreciated. Thank you, everyone.
Welcome again back to A Connect. Today we've got Senators Jordan Steele-John from WA, who's going to be presenting about the Greens' vision for accessible communications and other issues related to that. But before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're all meeting today. For me, it's the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. Thank you very much for joining us today, Senator.
Pleasure to be with you, Teresa. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I am on the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation here in Western Australia, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, while acknowledging that the sovereignty over this land was never ceded. My name is Jordan Steele-John and I'm the Greens Disability Rights and Justice spokesperson. And today I just want to share with you a little bit of what we as a party are proposing to do to bring accessible telecommunications and rights to language closer within the grasp of disabled people all across the country. The Greens believe that every single disabled person should be able to access the telecommunication services that we need in order to participate in our community, in order to participate in mainstream employment, and in order to get about our day-to-day lives, just like everyone else. This is a belief which we have that is based in our commitment to social justice, because ultimately, as we know, access to communications technology, access to the internet and the social opportunities that these spaces present for us as disabled people are actually a human right. They're also important facilitator of other services that are so important to us as disabled people. And during these COVID times, we have seen firsthand just how access to the internet and access to a phone connection, for instance, enables us to not only stay connected with our friends and family in a time of crisis, but also to access home and healthcare services via things like telehealth and other medical services that have now been provided via telecommunication devices or online. Based on this, the Greens took to the last election a platform, a policy platform that was aimed at transforming the entirety of our community and eliminating access and discrimination based upon access, I should say, and eliminating ableism and discrimination faced by disabled people everywhere it exists. And that had a particular focus on the telecommunications space. We committed $58 million to the expansion of Auslan interpreter services for members of the deaf community who need those services, who cannot access them right now. We also committed to the establishment of increased captioning across television services, and also the foundation of a national disability telecommunications service to provide products and information, training and support at a cost of about $3.5 million over what then would have been the last 2 years. We did all of these things to acknowledge the real deep importance of ensuring that no matter what your access needs are, you have the ability to get the information and support that you need when you need it, just like everyone else does. And these initiatives expand just into so many different parts of the telecommunications space, precisely because we understand in the Greens that access in the comm space is about more than just captioning. Captioning is really important, but it is just the first step in making so many of our services and spaces accessible. We were then and are now pushing for the expansion of audio description when it comes to television services across our public broadcasters and also our commercial broadcasters too. And we also are really aware of the fact that if you are particularly a deaf person, it is really important that you are given access to language, the ability and the opportunity to learn Auslan, to communicate with your deaf peers in your language. And that's why we have committed not only to expanding access to interpreter services, but also more broadly to celebrating deaf culture and the role that Auslan plays within that culture too. When it comes to audio description, we've been part of a campaign now for years and years to establish audio description on Australian TV, and we're really proud to have drafted a bill and introduced a bill to Parliament that would have achieved that here in Australia. And it was that pressure that we applied, combined with an ongoing campaign within the community, that finally saw the establishment of baseline audio description services on our national broadcasters 14 hours a week that now exist on the ABC and on SBS too. Now, while this is a good start, we need to keep going. We need to see those baseline hour levels increased over time, and we must see audio description implemented in commercial TV service as well. It is not good enough that these services are simply applied to the ABC and SBS. And beyond this, we need to make sure that there actually is a one-stop shop in this country for accessible telecommunications products and services. ACAN do an incredible job running this service at the moment, enabling disabled people to have a central hub to go to, so that we can ask a question. I have certain access needs. What products exist out there for me to meet those needs? What services do I need to access? These are like critical spaces for us disabled people, and the funding for these services must be continued and, in our view as Greens, expanded so that we can actually get access to this information when we need it. The last thing that I will say is that I think there is a real sense now as we journey together hopefully out of COVID-19, that our ability to connect with each other is more important now than ever before. And it is via the internet, via telecommunication services, that we as disabled people are facilitated quite often to do that. The entirety of our community has learned over the course of 2020 that via using these technologies, there is actually the opportunity to create accessible place and space and bring disabled people into community, into activity, enabling participation. And we cannot let the lessons of COVID-19, these new tactics and tools, fade from our community as the virus does. We need to make sure that the investments are made, that the rules are enshrined, that enable this access revolution to continue. And to set this as the new benchmark when it comes to creating events, when it comes to running businesses, when it comes to employing people, that these accessible, flexible, inclusive options are maintained. That's what's really front of my mind. I know it's front of ACAN's mind as well. And I'm really looking forward to working with ACAN and everyone in our community to make sure that these things remain, are expanded on, and enable access and inclusion for everyone.
Thanks very much for that, Jordan. It's really great to hear your perspectives about communications. We'll just ask you a couple of questions now to drill down on a couple of those issues that have come up. One of the issues relates to the last summer that we went through, and for many, the memories of the bushfire season are still quite fresh, and many people are still obviously recovering. But what we found during that time was that unfortunately, many people with disability were left behind when it came to accessing emergency services because of the inability to use options like direct text, instant message, web or video call to 000. We're just wondering, what changes do you think need to occur, and what changes should decision makers make to ensure that something as fundamental as 000 is actually accessible?
Such a good point, and I was really disturbed to see that during the bushfire season, so many of those emergency services really did fail, and it was left that we were left to a point of emergency services personnel like physically performing house checks, and the idea that nobody had thought to create a map of where people were that needed assistance beforehand was really deeply frustrating. And one of the things that has been hard to get an answer to, but we will continue to pursue this question, is where did that data go? There are a lot of house calls made, a lot of disabled folks identified, particularly in the ACT, when the fires started bearing down in the capital. I bloody hope it ain't being shredded. We need to be actually retaining that information and building it into definitely, de-identified or with the right privacy settings, but so that emergency service personnel know where to go straight away. I've got to say also that it needs to be, yes, we need to reimagine our emergency services processes with disabled people much more centered in that process, very important. We also need to make sure that our emergency systems generally are accessible and inclusive. I'm so sick of going into a building and the only warning system is auditory. Prepare for a fire drill. There's an emergency in your building. Evacuate now. And that ain't no good to a deaf person, or going into a building and the standard procedure, if there's a fire, is to put yourself in the stairwell and pray. That's a question of how we build our physical spaces. But it is really important to make sure that those baselines are there. I'd like to see. I think there's so much opportunity to expand baseline knowledge of Auslan to emergency services workers, even just key phrases and stuff, so that if you are interacting with either a deaf person or somebody that uses Auslan because of neurodiversity, for instance, there is that ability to establish that connection. So I think those things are really important, and they need to be looked at ahead of time, because unfortunately what happens is we only get to this stuff when somebody's died, and that's just not all right.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot more that we could be doing in relation to emergency service access, I think. So thank you for that. And thanks for your insights on that as well. I know you've already mentioned a little bit in the speech, but perhaps as you were one of the driving forces behind our audio description trial on SBS and ABC, perhaps you could just expand a bit more about the vision that you'd like to see for this going forward.
Well, I think, call me a radical, but I actually think we need to work rapidly towards the top. Well, first of all, we must expand audio description beyond the public broadcasters. Where television exists, audio description should exist, and that should be the baseline. The fact that the folks over at 9 and 7 and the rest of them are able now to still not use this stuff is ridiculous. So we need to actually, the legislation that Greens set down was not exclusive to the public broadcasters. It was actually focused very much at if you are broadcasting, regardless of whether you're funded publicly or not. In terms of the hours of content, I'm not satisfied with 14 hours. Absolutely ridiculous. If you ask anybody else, what do you think of 14 hours of original content every week? They blow their stack. So I think we need to be actually working ultimately towards parity. that's where we need to go. But if I remember rightly, the legislation that we produced had like a incremental increase over, I think it was a 5-year period, that tried to bring it at least up to 30 hours. But I really, having looked at the technology, I don't know what your argument is for anything less than anything less than taking it across the entirety of content. Like, you can't do that overnight. But I don't know why we would be producing programming that our deaf community can't engage with. It's sorry, it's been a long. The relevant community can engage with. So I've already had a rather long week. But the point is, if it is captioned, it should be bloody audio described. If it exists, it should be accessible. And I think that's the principle to which we should aspire.
Absolutely. And really, I absolutely agree with you as far as communications being a great enabler and leveler for everyone, if we can make sure that everyone has equal access. So thank you very much for your time today, Senator, and good luck with all the different activities and work that you're working on.
Thanks so much, Teresa. The only other thing I would mention is we need to do a lot more work in making politics and political process accessible and inclusive, and communications has a huge role to play here. It was only after some heavy lobbying from the community that the Prime Minister's daily COVID briefings were taken with an Auslan box similar to the one over my shoulder here. And it should just be the baseline. There should be somebody sitting in a booth somewhere in Parliament recording the entire exchanges in Auslan for people to follow along. And there needs to be a lot more changes in the way that politics is broadcast and spoken about, so that it actually can be accessible. Otherwise, we as disabled people, 20% of the population, are actually barred from getting the information we need to make informed democratic decisions.
Yeah, lots of opportunities for the future there. So thanks a lot for your time.
Thanks so much.